Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure for me to open this last session of workshops and to be part of this workshop, which is dealing with a subject matter, defining terrorism, which is very, very close to my heart. I've started my interest in the subject matter of terrorism approximately 30 years ago by dealing with this specific subject matter, terrorism definition. And I have to say that although I'm very used to change my own views, you know, you say you put two Israelis in one room, you have four opinions. Being seventh-generation Israeli, I take this to the extreme, and I don't only debate with my colleagues, I also debate a lot with myself. So as an outcome of that, I find myself differing with me on some of my thoughts. But if there is one constant thought or understanding on terrorism, which I hold for the last 30 years, and I have to say doing that against, maybe not against all odds, but against the main stream of thinking in the academic world and in the practical world. And finding myself in debate and sometimes even the best way to define it is conflict with colleagues and friends and experts and very knowledgeable people is on that subject of the definition of terrorism, which I'm sure you will learn more and explore from my distinguished colleagues. You will understand how difficult it is to define terrorism and hopefully how important it is to define terrorism at the same time. So the subject matter is really as close to my heart as could be. But it's not just the subject matter. It's also the fact that this specific closing workshop is designated to the memory of a very good friend of mine, my tutor, a pillar in the counterterrorism arena, Professor Ehud Sprintzak. I would like to open with a few words about Professor Sprintzak. Professor Sprintzak is one of the most known Israeli counterterrorism experts who specialized not only in terrorism, but I would say even in more specific on a certain type of terrorist attacks, which since he left, since he died, unfortunately, we find a lot of shortage in this work. And this is dealing with Jewish terrorism, with the far-right Jewish terrorism in Israel. Professor Sprintzak was a senior lecturer in political science in the Hebrew U. And he also has been the academic director of the Raoul Wallenberg Scholarship Program. One of the most important achievements, in my view, of Professor Sprintzak was that he actually was the founding dean of this school, the School of Government, the Lauder School of Government here at the Interdisciplinary Center, which we are part of it today. So he has also the contribution to that specific counterterrorism activities that we are conducting here at the Interdisciplinary Center. Professor Sprintzak was a visiting professor at Georgetown University, American University, and other universities altogether. In 1992, he was awarded the Landau Prize for the best political science book. He actually wrote a few books and co-authored a few. I will mention maybe two of them: Brothers Against Brothers, Violence and Extremism in Israeli Politics. Actually, this has become a must-read for any expert who's dealing with this field. He co-authored the Israeli Democracy Under Stress. Professor Sprintzak got his doctorate in political science from Yale University, and he passed away in November 2002. at the age of 62. Survived his wife, Ricky, who's actually with us here today, and we are honored to have you here, Ricky, and 4 children, and 2 grandchildren. Now it's 3. Yeah. On a personal note, really, Professor Sprinzak was very close to me. He was a personal friend of mine. He was my tutor in my PhD. We had many discussions. I learned a lot from him, and I personally miss him a lot. I do believe that in those conferences of counterterrorism in Israel, it's important to mention him because he left a gap which is not filled, and we all miss him. So thank you for that. And I want to go back to the subject matter of the definition of terrorism, and it's not a long step from describing Ehud Sprinzak, because I had many talks and discussions and debates with Ehud on that as well, which I have to admit, Ehud not necessarily adopted my views on that matter, although he understood the importance of the discussion. Another tutor of mine was Professor Ariel Merari in my master's degree, and I remember the first class that I went to my master's degree as a student, a first-year student. Professor Merari decided that the first subject matter that will be discussed is the definition of terrorism, as many of us are doing, I believe, in our courses. The first thing you do is teach the definition of terrorism. And Professor Merari said what is common knowledge in this respect, that A, it's very difficult to define terrorism. B, there is no one acceptable definition that is internationally accepted. And after a few minutes of explanation, he said, okay, so now when we understood that it's impossible to define terrorism, maybe unnecessary to define terrorism, we can move on. So I raised my hand and I said, excuse me, I don't think that we agreed on that. And I gave all my reasons, and believe me, you will hear them in a few minutes as well. And this started a very heated debate between him and me, which actually lasted the whole class. Whatever he planned for that class was totally ruined because we started to debate on that subject matter. The next week, we had the second class, and he came and said, since we agreed that there is no definition for terrorism, we can move on. And I said, we didn't agree. So you can imagine another class was dismissed on that specific subject matter that was not planned to discuss. I do believe that we have now the opportunity in this workshop to explore this sensitive, in a way, and complicated subject matter, which is the definition of terrorism. And the reason that we have this opportunity has to do with another friend of mine who's sitting here, and this is Peleg Reshev. Peleg is the Deputy Executive Director of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps. And Peleg actually came with this idea to conduct this workshop. It was not my initiative, it was his initiative, and in a way I'm his guest in this workshop. And the reason is that because the Jewish Diplomatic Corps has done an extensive research on this subject matter of the definition of terrorism and came forth with a concrete recommendation of a definition, which we will hear in a few minutes from the first speaker about that. And after that, we will have a very knowledgeable panel that will share their views about the definition and their perspective. And I will close the discussion, and after me, we will have Mr. Ivan Koedjikov. Do I say it right? Koedjikov, who is the head of Action Against Crime and Counterterrorism Coordinator at the Council of Europe, which will be the first commentator on whatever we will discuss here today. So with no further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Arsen Ostrovsky. He's the head of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps Task Force for the Definition of Terrorism in Israel. A few words about Arsen. Arsen Ostrovsky is a researcher at the Jewish Congress, dealing with international human rights as a lawyer, and former research fellow at the Hudson Institute. Arsen.
Dr. Ganor, first of all, thank you for your very kind introduction. Let me also at the outset pay my respect as well to Dr. Sprinczak. I did not know him personally, but from your words, he definitely sounded like someone very special, very important, and no doubt would miss him a lot. So first of all, would like to pay respects for him. Let me also acknowledge you again, sorry, Dr. Ganor, for all your work in leading the ICT, in putting the issue of counterterrorism on the front foot. We're at the 13th annual summit here, and given the calibre of speakers, guests, you're doing a fantastic job, so thank you for that. Also, once again, on behalf of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, I'd like to thank you for not just hosting this workshop, but for all your ongoing work and support. For that, we appreciate, and we thank you for that. To my fellow panelists, it's an honour to be with all of you here today. A couple of days ago, if you don't mind, Richard, I emailed you and I told you you have a habit of coming here in interesting times, especially everything that's happening now. You replied, yes, let's just hope we're not wearing respirators. We have about 2 hours and 55 minutes left, so let's hope you're right. Also, if I could thank Peleg for all your work in leading the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, and also to Rob Pinfold, who's sitting next to him, one of the research fellows there who's done some fantastic research on this task force on the definition of terrorism. So thank you to both of you for all your support as well. We're here today with the spectre of Syria looming over us, with Iran ever closer on the horizon, and we're here on a very special day, September 11th, the 12th anniversary of the terrorist attacks. This is no small coincidence. It is in large part also intended to shed light and develop strategies to combat one of the biggest evils facing our society today. And if I'm not mistaken, that's one of the reasons for the establishment of the Institute, which came in the wake of September 11. I wanted to break my remarks up in a couple of sections. One, about the importance of defining terrorism. I didn't so much want to devote my discussion on what an actual definition ought to be. We have far more learned experts than me on that. But I would like to stress about why it's so important, why we need that now more than ever. Just a very brief outline about the legal situation at the moment, where we stand, especially with the UN and various multilateral institutions. Touch on some of the reasons which Dr. Ganor mentioned already, but why there hasn't been a universal definition to date, and then suggest some concrete approaches in terms of how we can go about it, how we can reach there. From the outset, let me be clear. The lack of a united definition of terrorism over the preceding decades since September 11 demonstrates that despite some great progress, there are still many milestones to reach in the quest for a unified, effective global counterterrorism strategy. And one at the core centre of which lies what we believe is the need to establish a globally agreed, clear, authoritative and legally binding definition of terrorism, which is an indispensable and essential tool to combat terrorism itself. Quite simply, unless we can define what it is we are fighting, how can we defeat it? I speak before you today on behalf of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps. We are a worldwide non-partisan network of young professionals who advocate on behalf of a multitude of issues, this being one that's at the forefront of our concerns. But while we may have the word Jewish in our title, in our name, I also need to be here and stress to you that terrorism is not just a Jewish concern or an Israeli concern, albeit we are quite often one of the primary targets. I'm here to say that terrorism is a global phenomenon and a global threat affecting everyone. It does not matter whether you're Israeli, American, British, Australian, Iraqi. Terror knows no boundaries, has no limits. We're all vulnerable and susceptible to it. Today, also, it's important to recognise that terrorists are being increasingly more technologically competent, much more organised, much more globally minded in their means, And also importantly, terrorism today is also being perpetrated more and more, not as much by state actors, but by non-state actors and organisations and terrorist groups, using both conventional and non-conventional means. We can say with some confidence over the course of the research that we've conducted that there exists already an adequate legal system, framework dealing with respect to states, whether it's vis-a-vis War Crimes Acts, Geneva Conventions and other laws which explicitly prohibit deliberate targeting of civilians. But one of the main areas of concern is that this framework does not sufficiently take into account non-state actors in a clear, legal, unambiguous manner. So in some ways, the definitions we had yesterday must be updated to reflect the reality of today. This would provide a new legal apparatus to combat the threat to international peace, territorial integrity, and stability of states that threatens attacks on our most basic of human rights, our right to live in peace, safety, and security. You may ask, and maybe rightfully so, why do we need a global definition when most states and a number of multilateral institutions already have their own definitions? But therein also lies the problem, a large part of the problem. We have a plethora of different definitions. Some similar, many have also differences, others not, but all are open to individual interpretation. In 2005, former EU Counter-Terrorism Commissioner Mr. De Vries remarked that a lack of a global definition of terrorism is a key stumbling block to international cooperation in the fight against terrorism. Why is it necessary? The lack of an adequate legal framework for identifying, prosecuting, and acting against terrorists in international law constitutes today a vacuum that is often exploited by terrorist individuals, networks, and organisations. A definition will enhance international cooperation in the fight against terror through enhanced extradition procedures, cross-border and judicial cooperation. It will help remove the pernicious ambiguities surrounding the question of what counts, what does not count as terrorism. In other words, that old maxim, one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. Past examples of drug trafficking, child soldiering help elucidate the fact that when we identify the actual crime itself, we can synchronize our efforts to combat it. Might not necessarily eliminate it together, but we can get that much closer and make significant headway. A universal definition, whether it be by treaty or by the UN, will also be stipulated into law, thereby adding significantly greater legal weight in the requirement to identify, investigate, extradite, and persecute acts and perpetrators of terrorism. Yet a definition alone is no magic solution. However, without an authoritative definition, prohibition will continue to be circumvented and the fight against terrorism undermined. And lastly, an accepted international definition which rejects terrorism unequivocally will also convey greater moral clarity in our battle against one of the greatest evils of this century. Let me briefly touch on what the situation is now. I mentioned at the outset that most states have their own individual definitions. Within those states, take for example the United States, they have multiple different definitions, including within multiple different legislative frameworks and regulatory bodies. You also have definitions through your various multilateral institutions, EU, NATO, Arab League, a number of other regional bodies. Taking the EU, for example, that was one of the first multi-state bodies to actually agree on a legally binding and shared definition of terrorism. That was in 2002. Importantly, the EU definition is binding on each of the 28 member states. But the problem here again lies also partly in the fact that each one of those 28 states also have their own definitions as well. The fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, we have but one global body with the reach and capacity to speak for the entire community of nations, and that's the UN. There's a lot we can discuss about the UN, especially with respect to its efforts in dealing with issues relating to terrorism and counter-terrorism. I'm going to try and focus on two or three that specifically deal with the legal aspects of the definition of terrorism. One, in 2002, in the immediate wake of the September 11 attacks, the international community at the UN, seemingly united in its desire to reject terrorism, immediately created an ad hoc committee. This was done through the UN General Assembly's 6th Committee, which deals with legal issues. The first task, define terrorism. 11 and a half years later, here we are today, on the 12th anniversary of September 11, we're still nowhere near. In fact, we're at a complete deadlock. In 2011 and 12, when I was working at the Hudson Institute, we were dealing a lot with the UN. So I had the opportunity to actually sit in on a lot of these meetings of the 6th Committee. My first clue that there's something not quite right here was when they were deliberating the definition of terrorism. I walked in, my very first day there, and you had Saudi Arabia literally lecturing Israel and the United States on what the definition ought to be and shouldn't be. That ought to flag a few things early on. But the main reason, essentially, why we have reached a deadlock at the UN, and in all honesty, likely to be heading that way unless things change course, is that it can be described as there's a line that's been drawn in the sand by what we can call Western liberal democracies on the one hand, and the group of nations representing the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries. Essentially, the OIC is in their interpretation of what ought to constitute terrorism, are demanding two important exceptions which Western countries simply cannot agree to. One is an exemption against acts of foreign occupation, aggression, colonialism. In other words, some of the very reasons and justifications behind terrorism. The other is also seeking to insert, within the definition of terrorism, specific reference to state terrorism. As I mentioned before, state terrorism is, we can argue, adequately defined within the existing legal framework, but what that will do in many ways is it will hamper our efforts to take defensive action against terrorist acts. The committee has also been, since 2000 now, even before September 11, trying to hold a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. Regrettably, that has not moved very far, largely because of the inability to come up with a definition of terrorism. So is all hope lost at the UN? Not quite. There's also significant amount of progress that has been made, but it needs to be pushed further. Following the Beslan Chechen hostage crisis in 2004, when 380 people died, mostly children, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1566 in October 2004. That was adopted within the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It gave an exhaustive definition of terrorism, which ought to be acceptable to most liberal Western democracies. It noted that such acts of terrorism under no circumstances were justifiable by any consideration. It spoke about the need to strengthen judicial cooperation in combating terrorism, specifically prosecution and extradition. And there was a unanimous decision. It was sponsored by Russia, 15-0 unanimous decision. We know how hard it is to get a unanimous decision at the UN Security Council today, with everything we're seeing with Syria and a number of other issues. Potentially, it sounds like an amazing breakthrough, but there's a problem. The UN Security Council was also a body of 15 nations. It did not speak for the entire community of nations within the General Assembly. More recently, in 2011, we had the special UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which looked into the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. Importantly, this was the first international court with jurisdiction over the crime of terrorism and was specifically mandated by the UN Security Council. The tribunal produced a landmark ruling on the definition of terrorism, holding that for the first time, the definition of terrorism has now been crystallized to constitute a distinct international crime under customary international law. Relevantly, and this is very important, the tribunal also said that there is a duty on all states to prosecute those who commit acts of terrorism, but perhaps most importantly, it explicitly rejected the freedom fighter concept. But again, we run into another problem. The court, as authoritative as that decision is, again, it was a court-mandated decision that was not agreed to within the body of nations representing the UN or the larger community of nations. So what does all this indicate? Is achieving a broadly accepted, legally binding definition possible at the UN? Key word, again, being broadly accepted. Well, it might seem like a very uphill task, but this is not something that we can resign or forfeit against. Something we need to push harder, and we need to be more creative and look at other means to try and obtain as broad a coalition as possible for a definition that's acceptable to the largest body of nations as possible. A couple of ideas for some strategy and action plan. Despite the gloom and doom I may have outlined above and many decades of deadlock, there has been some recent diplomatic, legal and political progress at an international level, which does demonstrate an emerging consensus, at least amongst Western liberal democracies. We have the UN Security Council Resolution 1566, the Hariri Tribunal, the largely what I would deem somewhat similar definitions of terrorism when we look at definitions between US, UK, Europe, NATO, mostly Western-leaning countries. But we have to start with something. One option may be, whilst we've hit this deadlock at the UN, is perhaps to arrange a high-level convention of terrorism, the same one that the UN has been unable to agree on for the past 13 years, but perhaps at least at the start, even outside the UN framework. This could be with a view to the creation of an all-encompassing treaty signed by a multitude of nations that not only defines terrorism, but outlines an action plan for combating as well. More and more countries could sign over time, wherein it would become customary international law and may lead to full UN involvement at a later date. Europe will be key to this. The UN, as I mentioned, with its 22 member states, democracies, contains the largest broadly accepted definition amongst a group of nations already. I would add also to this the importance of the Council of Europe, and I'm glad that Ivan is here representing them. The Council consists of 47 member states of Europe, twice the number of the EU. Unlike the EU, the Council does not make binding laws, but it does have significant moral authority, including with the European Court of Human Rights and the OSCE. Moreover, this represents an ideal opportunity to expand the pan-EU definition of terrorism, so there is a synchrony between the EU and the Council of Europe member states between the Council of Europe and member states of both organisations. My apologies. It is anticipated and hoped that by doing so, this will also create a domino effect. Europe is one of the leading lights in many ways in modern democratic thought. We have the EU with leading so much the fight for global human rights. With them as a united body, with their 28 nations, it is hoped that that will create a domino effect. The United States obviously will be key, and hopefully many other regional bodies and Western liberal democracies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and others can lead the way and join. In striving for the adoption of an international definition of terrorism, we must also build as broad a consensus as possible. Civil society will play an instrumental role in this, and we must reach out to them. This includes organisations and individuals of different backgrounds, NGOs, human rights groups, academia, and groups of different faiths coalescing for this common purpose. Again, let me stress this is not and ought not to be an Israeli-centric campaign. Israelis are not the only victims of this. We're all victims. It needs to be a global campaign and also supported in public society through media, academia, public policy and government, raising the definition about the importance of, raising the awareness about the importance of a universal definition of terrorism. A couple of words in conclusion. A definition alone is no magic solution. It is only one part of the campaign. We also need military effort, public policy, military, intelligence, cultural, educational knowledge and political solutions as well. But it has to start somewhere. And unless we can define what it is we're trying to fight, we cannot defeat it. Without a broadly accepted authoritative definition, our fight against terrorism will continue with one arm tied behind our backs. An accepted international definition which rejects terrorism unequivocally presents a unique opportunity for the moral community of nations to once and for all define, prescribe and restrict the act of terrorism. Time, again, is of the essence. We cannot afford to wait any longer. And Personally, I could not think of a more perfect forum to get this ball rolling, to raise the issue, to put it at the top of the agenda than here at the IDC, with all the international experts gathered, with all of you here, with all our multitude of lawyers and officials and diplomats and practitioners, to raise awareness why we need a universal definition, why it's important, and why we simply cannot wait any longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arsene. Before introducing the second speaker, I would like to acknowledge the presence and actually thanks the workshop assistant, and I refer to Mrs. Latrice Netless, who is doing a remarkable job in this workshop and other workshops. Thank you very much, Latrice. The second speaker need no introduction, but for those who just landed from space, a few words about Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard Kemp is a special advisor on international terrorism to the UK House of Commons Home Affairs Committee and frequently commentator on security defense issues in international media. Colonel Kemp was formerly a commander of British forces in Afghanistan. He retired from the Army in 2006 after serving 30 years as an infantry officer. Richard.
Well, thank you very much. The comment that Arsene referred to about respirators was made by me before the conspiracy between President Putin, or Prime Minister Putin, whatever he calls himself at present, and the President of the United States to cause President Assad to capitulate under the threat of what John Kerry described as an unbelievably small attack. So, I mean, I thought Assad had more in him than to crumble under the idea of maybe a couple of grenades being thrown his way, but apparently not. Anyway, fortunately, no respirators, and I don't think there will be. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not an academic, nor am I a legal expert. I was a soldier for most of my life, and I didn't spend very much of my time sitting down wondering and agonizing over what terrorism was or what it wasn't and how we define it. In fact, I spent most of my life, like I suspect many others of you in this room, seeing how best we could smash the people that were doing it and protect those people that were the targets of terrorism. Although I did, and while I'm on that subject, sorry, I'm going to deviate very slightly, but I'm not going to spend too long on talking about the definition, but so I can afford a few moments. While I'm on that subject of practical counter-terrorism, I've got every reason to be extremely grateful to Israel for the support that we in the UK have received from Israel and continue to receive from Israel. And one of those reasons to be grateful was that when I as Boaz mentioned, I was commander of British forces in Afghanistan. And although I'd spent 30 years, virtually 30 years up to that time, not quite, fighting terrorism, we hadn't faced the threat of suicide terrorism before then. We had lots of different unpleasant forms of terrorism we dealt with, but suicide wasn't one of them. And when I went to Afghanistan to command forces there, I sort of realized just before I went that this was going to be a big, I say just before, not because I'm completely stupid, but because in the British Army you only get a couple of weeks' notice that you're going somewhere, so I didn't have very long to think about it. Realised that this was going to be a problem. And I asked out the British authorities, the British military authorities, what the policy was in Britain, the British forces for dealing with suicide attack. And the answer was, we don't have a policy, we don't have a training plan, we have nothing. We just send the troops out and they just do it, because it's too difficult. And I mean, I'm sure many of you have been military commanders or leaders in other walks of life. That's not the way that you command anything. So I was working at that time quite closely with the head of the Mossad station in London, and I said to him, "What can you get someone from the U.S. embassy, from the Israeli embassy rather, to come down and talk to me about how the Israelis handle suicide terrorism. And he said, no, I can't do that. And I thought, well, yeah. We've shared a few secrets in the past. You know, I've told you a few things I shouldn't have done, and you've told me a couple of things you possibly shouldn't have done, allegedly. And we've shared a couple. Anyway, he said, no, I'm going to do better than that. And he sent to Israel for the IDF's top expert on countering suicide attacks, and he was a brigadier general, I think commanding an active brigade at the time, or division, and was he came over to London. He and I spent a number of hours in the lobby of a hotel in West London with him talking and me writing. And what he said to me essentially became the British forces' policy on dealing with suicide attacks, and remains so today. It's still the policy that's in use. So I've got a lot to be thankful to Israel for. That doesn't include, of course, the fact that even today the Israeli technology, medical technology, is being used to save British soldiers' lives in Afghanistan, and counter-IED technology is being used, Israeli counter-IED technology is being used to save British and American soldiers' lives in Afghanistan as well as civilians. And not, of course, to mention the extensive use we've made of UAV technology from Israel. None of that is ever mentioned in the media, and Britain tries to keep it under wraps, not because it's an operational secret, but because politically the people in our government deem it to be a little bit awkward, shall we say. Anyway, I'm sorry to deviate slightly, but the only time in my career really that I did spend a fair bit of time worrying and wondering about the definition of terrorism was when I worked for the Joint Intelligence Committee in London, and this was sort of early 2002 onwards, and we were engaged in devising what we called Contest, our counter-terrorism strategy, and that obviously involved defining terrorism. And again, I hope I don't appear to be sort of kissing too many people today, but in that time, in my time then in the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK, which is basically pulls together all UK intelligence to brief the Prime Minister on, I depended very heavily on the excellent output of the ICT in all sorts of areas, and I was very, very impressed by what was being produced during those years by the ICT, obviously all unclassified stuff, but highly valuable for us. So I was then very grateful, and I remain extremely grateful for your organisation's work, Boaz. Thank you. And in fact, a very distinguished, I can't remember his name, he's so distinguished, British counter-terrorist expert attempted over a period of a number of months, I think, with a working group to define terrorism. And at the end of it, he was involved in framing British counter-terrorist legislation in the early part of this century. And he came to the conclusion there can't be a definition of terrorism, and anyone else who is interested shouldn't spend too much time thinking about it because it just scrambles your brain. Well, it certainly scrambles my brain, but clearly it doesn't scramble the brain of Arsene or any of the others here on the panel. But what I want to do, really, to talk briefly about the problem. I want to focus, actually, my remarks on the definition that Arsene's organisation, the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, have drafted. Has everybody seen that here? Is that a document that's been put out? Am I allowed to mention it? Good. I just did.
You're being taped as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm not a member of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps. I'm not Jewish, although I was accused of being Jewish on the BBC recently. In fact, it was when I was over here last. Sorry. Halfway in, yes, the BBC think I am. The BBC tell only the truth, as you know. And I'm certainly never been accused of being a diplomat or even diplomatic. So I'm not a member, but I have had the pleasure of reading that document, which I think is extremely good, and I want to focus my remarks around that document. Before I do, I think in the future we're facing more terrorism, not less terrorism, and that's why it is extremely important that we come up with a definition. And I think we're perhaps facing more dangerous terrorism, not less dangerous terrorism. And that, I think, was one of the premises of, one of the themes of this, this whole conference, the idea that we may be entering a period where there is greater danger now of terrorists gaining weapons of mass destruction than they have in the past. And I would share that apprehension as well. You know, I think we only need to look at the instability caused by the Arab Spring, the potential that has for... I do think it actually should be called the Arab Spring. A lot of people say it should be called the Arab Winter. But if you experienced an English spring, you would understand how close the Arab Spring is to it. The instability caused by including the phenomenal effectiveness of Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Syria, and what they've been doing. I mean, I think it's quite staggering. It's awful, but it is impressive. And they've clearly learned a great deal from the mistakes they made in Iraq. And of course, the mob in Afghanistan, in Syria today, are the direct descendants of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and his butchery that he perpetrated on the Iraqi people, as well as forces there for a number of years. We also have a problem that's developing, or going to develop more, in South Asia as NATO forces pull out of Afghanistan. They won't, I don't think, pull out completely in 2014, but they will substantially pull out. And that will cause, I think, a shot in the arm for Al-Qaeda. They will undoubtedly portray it as giving us a bloody nose. It will definitely increase their support. And although I think they will continue to come under big pressure there from the Americans, particularly by drone strikes, I think it'll still be an enduring problem and will help to increase the problem of terrorism. So I think it's essential that we have a definition which will help us to counter the whole, what I consider to be a likely expanding problem. I want to just, and I hope again this doesn't appear like my work, because it's not my work, it's nothing to do with me, but I'm going to read, if you don't mind, Peleg, do you mind me reading your definition? Okay. Because I say my remarks are focused on this. International terrorism is any act involving a transnational element intended to cause death, bodily injury, or property damage to a civilian or any other person not taking part in the hostilities in a situation of armed conflict, when the purpose or motive of such an act, by its nature or context, is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. I trust you've got that. I'll be asking questions in a minute. And I just want to think a bit about that. First point I'd like to make is this question of terrorists or freedom fighters, and whether there should be any consideration given to freedom fighters, or to an exclusion from terrorism in certain circumstances. And I think, you know, there are 2 points of view. One being that violence against the public and against public institutions is terrorism, irrespective of the merits of the objectives of the perpetrators. The other, of course, is that you can distinguish between terrorists and freedom fighters. The latter, perhaps, arguably, being those who are pursuing the right to self-determination in societies where there are no legitimate means of securing change. And, you know, you could include within that category, of course, Al-Qaeda in Syria, possibly. I don't know. Personally, I wouldn't describe them as freedom fighters, but I think that's one example. And the question is whether there should be a definition of terrorism which is capable of distinguishing between that kind of political violence which seeks to establish democracy in theory, and I know that that's not necessarily their agenda at all, or the protection of fundamental rights where they don't exist, and distinguishing those which seek to subvert democracy or subvert fundamental rights. And some of that concern about freedom fighters, oblique terrorists, is dealt with in the Jewish diplomatic corps definition, when it says that terrorism is violence, and if I understand this correctly, terrorism is violence directed against civilians. Because that then, you know, that means maybe that arguable freedom fighters in Syria who are attacking Syrian government, Syrian military targets, are not terrorists by virtue of the fact that they're not attacking civilians, which this definition excludes. But it does raise the question about how you categorize civilians working for the army, working for the armed forces. Police officers, are they civilians? Technically, I believe they are in Britain anyway. The intelligence services, and also targeting national leaders in charge of repressive states. And, you know, are they legitimate targets because they are the leaders of the repression? Is there a distinction between political leaders who are military and who are civilians, like the good former Colonel Gaddafi, sadly deceased? He was a captain, Gaddafi. Gaddafi wasn't a colonel, he was a captain. He made himself a colonel when he took over Libya, but I find it a bit offensive to hear him referred to as Colonel Gaddafi, because I was a colonel myself, as some of others of you may have been. And I'm more than happy to be associated with real colonels, such as Colonel Sanders and his fantastic fried chicken, but not the likes of Gaddafi. So I always like to point out that he was a captain. But and also in that same context of freedom fighters versus terrorists, where does blowing up a government building fit into that equation? Is that terrorism as under the Jewish diplomatic corps definition, or is it not? In the context of trying to free a state from repression. Obviously, there are big, and I'm not going to go into this because there are people who know a lot more about it than I do, but there are obviously big difficulties with giving a freedom fighter exception to the terrorist definition, not least some of the treaties that we and I'm sure you as well are party to. Another phrase that I want to pick out from the definition is any act intended to cause death, bodily injury, or property damage. So that is the kind of activity that is being included within this definition of terrorism. Any act intended to cause death, bodily injury, or property damage. I think it's important that property damage is included, although some people argue it shouldn't be, and some definitions don't include it. And for example, the tactic that we fought for a number of years against IRA terrorism of placing explosive devices into, say, a hotel, a school, some other building, placing a bomb, and issuing warnings in time for people to get out. Therefore, not necessarily threatening the lives of people, but threatening property. I think, you know, to exclude that sort of activity, which was a fundamental part of their campaign, as an act of terrorism, we're wrong. So I think it's important that remains there. And UK counter-terrorism legislation, our definition within that, and I think currently, or the Americans have hundreds, we only have one definition of terrorism, I think, at present, certainly for legislative purposes. And it includes an act designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system as being an act of terrorism. So again, it's a question really, does that need to be part of a definition? Should it be part of a definition? Obviously, you know, an act such as disrupting an air traffic control system, which may or may not bring aircraft down and kill people, but could cause massive disruption to normal life. And the Canadian definition also includes the words an act that causes serious interference with or serious disruption of an essential service, facility or system, whether public or private. Again, that's for, I think, possibly for comment whether those areas should be included. Next element, and I'm coming on fairly, making a bit of progress now, to a civilian or any other person not taking active part in the hostilities in a situation of armed conflict. Now, I find that this is the part of the definition, the proposed definition, that I have difficulty with, and it may be because I haven't understood it, but I'm going to run through my problems. Lee Rigby was a British soldier who was killed. His head was cut off, and various other limbs were hacked at with machetes and other knives and instruments by two what I would describe as terrorists on the streets of London only a few months ago. He was a serving soldier. The killings of American soldiers in Fort Hood, both of those incidents had transnational elements, which is also an element of this definition of terrorism. So would those acts not be included as acts of terrorism because they were directed against soldiers in all cases, or airmen, whatever they were? Are soldiers killed in Afghanistan or in Sderot not victims of terrorism just because they happen to be soldiers, whereas civilians killed in those places are victims of terrorism? And if fighters came across the border from southern Ireland to northern Ireland, which they frequently did, IRA terrorists, or from Gaza into southern Israel and killed civilians, they're therefore terrorists, but if they kill soldiers, they're not terrorists, according to this definition. So this is why I have a problem with that. And again, it raises the question, what about police? What about intelligence officers, intelligence agents, civil servants, technicians supporting military forces or conducting counter-terrorist operations? What about a drone pilot based in a nice sleepy little town in Lincolnshire in England? A drone pilot who is conducting offensive operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan from 3,000 miles away. Is he a legitimate target? Is a civilian technician that is that's servicing the drone systems back in England as well, is he a legitimate target? I think these questions obviously have to be considered. And the final point in this particular issue is, which is the question of whether a military person is a legitimate target of terrorism or is not, or it ceases to be a terrorist act, is obviously in armed combat, it is unlawful for somebody who is wearing civilian clothes or not openly bearing arms to attack a soldier anyway. So what does that make him? The final thing, just to mention from the definition, when this comes to motivation for terrorism, when the purpose or motive of such an act, by its nature or context, is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organisation to do or to abstain from doing any act. Again, in intent, the UK definition, and I'm not saying this should be the case, but the UK definition, as other national domestic definitions include, that an act that's made for the purposes of advancing a political, religious, racial or ideological cause, specifically stated in order to separate out this form of activity from ordinary criminal activity, ordinary decent crime as we call it, which might seek to coerce a government nevertheless. It might not be terrorism, it might still be crime. And what about also under this part of the definition, when the purpose or motive of such an act by its nature or context is to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international organisation to do or abstain from doing any act? What about assassination of Syrian or Iranian nuclear scientists? I don't suppose any country would want to do that, but if it did, would that be an act of terrorism? What about, and again, that act might be intended to compel a government to abstain from doing something. What about assassination of terrorist leaders in Gaza, in Pakistan or Yemen by Americans, by Israeli forces, whatever? Are those then terrorist acts? And again, this raises other issues, which I'm not going to go into detail on, but if terrorists are deemed lawful targets for attack by an armed forces or by intelligence services, then if that's questioned in a court, how are we going to prove that they were doing what they were alleged? In other words, that they were terrorist leaders, without maybe producing highly sensitive and secret intelligence to back it up, which a government might not want to do? And might that then not lead a sword hanging over an intelligence officer or a military officer or soldier who takes part in these activities, waiting to see if they're going to be charged with terrorism, and perhaps for many years as they concern themselves with retrospective legislation. You know, can we expect a government that wants to carry out those form of activities, and I would argue that in the future more and more will, to sign up to a definition, to this particular definition of terrorism? Maybe, although state use of terrorism is not included for reasons Arsene explained a moment ago, maybe it needs to be specifically excluded, possibly. But again, that raises huge issues. I've spoken for long enough. I'm not going to bang on anymore. I'm very happy to take questions, which I shall delegate to Arsene afterwards. The only other thing I'd say, just to mark the fact that we are here on 9/11, a lot of people in Britain, kind of memories get very short, and even of our own major Al-Qaeda terrorist attack in July 2005, when we had suicide attacks on the London Underground. And a lot of people, even today, tend to think, oh, that 9/11, that was a long, long time ago, and it was America. But actually, don't know if you're aware of it or not, but on 9/11, more Britons were killed in the Twin Towers than had ever in history been killed in any other single terrorist attack. And we've had a huge history of terrorism in Northern Ireland and, of course, in our former empire, which arguably we should still be in charge of, but we're not. Anyway, so more Britons were killed on 9/11 than in any other single act. I sort of just mention that as today is 9/11. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for this in-depth analysis of the definition of the Jewish diplomatic corps. I guarantee that every question that you pose will not stay unanswered, because in my presentation I'm going to refer to each one of those questions, although I do not necessarily adopt the definition as is, but I think that the definition of the corps is a great important step forwards to what is needed to achieve. But your fair questions and very knowledgeable question at least will be answered. I'm not sure that you will accept the answer, but it will be answered by me later on, and maybe by some of my colleagues. And the next speaker is Dr. Magnus Norell. Magnus is an adjunct scholar at the Washington University for Near East Policy and the Senior Policy Advisor to the European Foundation for Democracy. He has worked as a senior analyst at the Swedish Defense Research Agency and the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, and has held positions in the Swedish Secret Service and Swedish military intelligence. Magnus.
Right. This is not an easy topic to address from any angle. And before I start, I just want to apologize if I will be a bit meandering, because I'm approaching this topic from both, and actually Richard gave me the cue here. I'm approaching this from both the angle of an academic, but also from the angle of an operational. But maybe first, on a personal note, I would probably not be standing here if it hadn't been for Ehud Sprinzak. I didn't know that this was going to be here. But many, many years ago, when I first spent some time in Israel doing research for my PhD, which had nothing to do with terrorism, I should add. It was focused on Israeli political philosophy, really. But I came across an article by Ehud Sprinzak that really intrigued me. And I guess if you spend some time in Israel doing research on any topic, sooner or later you're going to run into terrorism, whether you like it or not, and whether you plan to do it or not. But anyway, that article really kicked me down the road to terrorism studies as well. I don't know if that was good or bad. The jury's still out on that. But here I am. So I owe him a lot, and I did read his books. Also, I'm from a a very peaceful little country. Every time I hear Scandinavian countries named here, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Norway, it's always in the realm of it's like something that's not really real. I heard it in the morning session when we talked about failed states, and people were saying, well, it's not like Denmark, it's not Finland. And we are real, we do. I'm just saying, okay? I'm just mentioning that, we are actually. Sorry? We love your book. Oh, well, thank you. But it's kind of interesting, and I'm a very lonely person back home dealing with these issues, and I probably wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for my affiliation with the Washington Institute. But this is important because Sweden has gratefully been spared any major terrorist attack. We've had a few back in the 80s, and there was a close call only a few years ago, as you may remember, in December 2010, when we had a first attempted suicide attack in Stockholm. He only managed to kill himself, but it was a very close call. And I also, the way I'm going to do this, I think, I'm going to wrap it around some operational experiences I've had. And I'm finding myself also disagreeing with Arsen and maybe also with Boaz and maybe agreeing with Erhud, because let me say that from the start, I'm not so sure chasing a common definition of terrorism is such a good idea. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but it's a bit like chasing the Holy Grail. I find myself agreeing with a lot of the questions and raised by Colonel Kemp here. And let me start off on this trip. Some years after my first stay in Haifa, when I saw this article by Ehud, I served with the UN in Somalia, the UNOSOM 2, Black Hawk Down and all that. And actually, that was the first time I ran into anything associated with Al-Qaeda. There was a report, U.S. Defense Intelligence report on that. And as Colonel Kemp was saying, we didn't spend too much time thinking about definitions, but spending a lot of time trying to avoid getting hit by the terrorists, and as he so subtly said, smashing them. And it struck me then that that was a very operational, very concrete, very direct way of dealing with a very concrete problem. It's not that I'm against definitions, and you have to know what you're dealing with. But I think, from the bottom of my heart, and having spent some time with this, though, that it will be virtually impossible to find a common definition of terrorism that everybody really would agree to. You'll find, the European Union has one, as was pointed out, and we'll probably hear more about that, which is working. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty parts, every nation still uses its own definitions, and it works. And that will perhaps be if you forget everything else I say, I think the tools needed to fight, to combat terrorism is already here. We have them in our toolbox already. It's a question of using them wisely. And maybe you can do it the way we did, for instance, after 9/11. You change some of the laws, and to highlight the fact that if something is done that can be defined as terrorism, the punishment will be worse. But it is a crime. It is a crime, and it should be treated as a crime. That does not exclude using arms, but it is, in essence, a crime. Also in the U.S., I should point out, it is a crime there as well, even if armed forces are used. But the Somalian experience was really that you're dealing with something that is of course, that was an armed conflict, and you didn't really have time to or your chance to catch anyone, bring them to justice. But the way it was done was outside any laws of war or anything like that, and of course you had to adapt to that. So I think there's something to be said for the difference between the context is important. If you have terrorism in a context like Somalia, or if you have it in a major city in Western Europe, it's different. People will get killed, but the way you handle it and the context is so important, and that has to be, I think, that has to be addressed even in the working definitions that you use. And that, I think, is one reason why it's so difficult to try to nail down a common definition of terrorism. And just to go on a bit with the Somalian experience, also and it's been mentioned here too, this adage of one man's terrorist is another one man's freedom fighter. Of course, I don't buy that. You know, one man's terrorist is another man's terrorist as well. But those political disagreements will be there all the time. They're not going to disappear just because you have a definition that maybe more people are accepting. You will still run into these problems that, no, that's not terrorism. This is a freedom fight. I don't think you can escape that by finding this definition. And I think it will be much more useful to spend the energy somewhere else. Namely, operationalize the way you frame your laws and you frame the fight. And I think that's much more useful. Now, fast forward from Somalia to another hotspot that I've been to a number of times. That's Lebanon. Back in the days, as we say, when the security zone was still there, when there was a security zone there, that Israel was sort of normally in control of anyway. And some of the people I met there, the Hezbollah operatives and people in the political echelons of the Hezbollah. Here you have an organization, and I should say this from the start. I belong to the group of people who argued strongly that Europe, the EU, should have taken the chance and designated the whole organization as a terrorist organization. It's ridiculous to say that they have an armed wing and a political. It's stupid beyond belief. So we really missed an opportunity there. But that's all politics, and at the time that was as much as you could get. Where does that leave us? In a worse position than before, I think. Now you have to try to find ways to delineate, to say that this person belongs to the armed wing of the Hezbollah. There's no such thing, and this person doesn't. And I think in essence that might make things easier for the Hezbollah and their work in Europe. I find it very strange. But still, in Lebanon, you're dealing with an organization that is also a political party, that is also a social movement, that does a lot of legitimate work in Lebanon. And I don't think that's been. I think one reason for this different definitions here, the one reason for Europe to say that we're only going to designate the military wing, is of course to try to address the fact that what do we have here? We have an organization that does it all. It's a criminal organization, it's a terrorist organization, it's a political party, it's a social movement. How do you deal with that? So the European answer here, the EU answer, with the exception of the Netherlands actually, said that this is how we're going to do it. I don't think it's going to work, but it's a way to dealing with the problem. And again, it comes back to the fact that you're trying to find a common denominator, a common definition of something that I don't think you can. But the way to deal with that, again, is to look at the context, see what you're up against, and you go from there, instead of chasing this holy grail, this dream of trying to find a common denominator. I keep coming back to that, and this will be the main message here. I think this is extremely difficult to find, and we will keep running into these difficulties. And when I brought this up back home, when the negotiations were going on inside Europe, before the designation in July of Hezbollah's armed group, the the counter argument was not so much the fact that they missed an opportunity to argue with me there, but it was not so much the fact that we have to adapt to the fact that Hezbollah is more than only a terrorist organization, It was more the fact that we're not going to go into this because it's too much trouble. If we go down this road, it will be an endless way of making troubles. And the European Union, 28 countries could never agree on. We can't even agree on how a cucumber should look. What do why it's and so I think it's and I think that was so the fact that we do have a definition here in the EU is a good thing. It's more than it's a long one, and it's somewhat cumbersome, but it's there, and it may help you as an individual European Union country to deal with the crime of terrorism when we face it. But beyond that, I don't think it's useful to spend energy that is better spent on combating the actual problem. I think that's extremely important. And in January of this year, as you may remember, there was a trial in Cyprus where a Swedish-Lebanese citizen was indicted for planning terrorist attacks. He was caught last summer on Cyprus. And I was asked by this Cypriot, the prosecution, to be there as an expert witness. So I spent some time there. And it was crystal clear to me, and they told me this, that there's no way that Cyprus would try to accuse this guy of a terrorist crime. It's not going to happen. That's what he did. But the chances of Cyprus doing this was nil. And this was before the designation of Hezbollah's armed group. And maybe, if that had been done before, they may have been able to do that. But the message I got was, and this was back in January, that no, I don't think we're going to go down that road, even if we had a chance, even if Europe had agreed to such a definition beforehand. Because again, Cyprus is in the European Union. We do have a common definition of terrorism. So if they wanted, they could have used that, but they didn't. So again, it comes back to the fact that this is very, very much a political problem. And instead of trying to beat your head against that wall, go around the wall or climb over it, and get on with it. And just as a parting shot here, I don't know if anyone of you was at the panel yesterday. Boaz was there yesterday afternoon on incitement. Good, because then you haven't heard the story. Dave Pollock, who chaired the session, was telling us about a U.S. Supreme Court judge back in the 1950s who was asked to define pornography. And he said, I can't, but I know it when I see it. I think that's a very useful way of trying to look at terrorism as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. It's clear to me that my job will be more difficult than I thought, but it's fine. Next speaker is Professor Vitor Franco Pisano. Professor Pisano is advisor on terrorism and counterterrorism at the Italian Atlantic Committee and chairman of the Intelligence and Security Department of the International University of Social Sciences. Professor Pisano is a retired U.S. Army colonel and served in military police and general staff assignments in the United States and Europe over 30 years. He is a former consultant at the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is certainly a source of great satisfaction for me to be a participant in this very significant conference. And I wish, as an American resident of Rome, to thank the Italian Atlantic Committee for having me in the delegation present here today. Insofar as the main purpose of this workshop is to stress the importance of defining terrorism, I will briefly and hopefully simply address three aspects of terrorism. First, its essential elements. Second, its major manifestations. And third, the threat it poses to society. If at any time I should not be clear, you may wish to give me some sort of a sign, preferably a polite one. Let us then begin by a major consideration. We have been living with what we might call contemporary terrorism since the 1960s. Notwithstanding the passage of over 50 years, to date, we still do not have a universally accepted definition of terrorism. In my view, this should not surprise us. Why? Because, on the one hand, the terrorist phenomenon is a complex one. On the other hand, the term terrorism is not a precise term. I repeat, it is not a precise term. We can, nonetheless, on the basis of empirical observations and considerations, adopt what I would call a functional description of terrorism. I say again, a functional description, not a definition. And I would submit to you, in the first place, that terrorism is a form of unconventional conflict. Why? Because on the one hand, it cannot be equated to a civil, orderly, democratic contest. On the other hand, it can in no way be equated to the classical battlefield, which is governed by the rules of the international law of war. More precisely, terrorism is a form of unconventional conflict characterized by four essential elements. The first is criminal violence. The second is political, religious, or political social motivation. The third, clandestine structures and dynamics. And the fourth, action by non-state actors with or without the support of a sponsor state. These elements are not only essential, but they're also distinguishing, because criminal violence distinguishes terrorism from the legitimate use of force. Political, social, or political religious motivation distinguishes terrorism from both common and organized crime. Common and organized crime mostly pursue economic ends, and in no case are they concerned with political objectives. They may use politics instrumentally, but their ultimate ends are economic in nature and in a way political. Clandestine structures and dynamics distinguish terrorism from ordinary political violence, which instead takes place overtly. Finally, action by non-state actors with or without the support of a sponsor state or patron state, as some call it, differentiates terrorism from actions directly attributable to a state. By this, I refer to violations of international law, violations of human rights, violations of accepted diplomatic practices. That is the reason why I consider those four elements essential, because they enable us to distinguish terrorism from other phenomena that have nothing to do with terrorism as such, although they may have some commonalities. Obviously, all four of those elements have to be present in order for terrorism to be there. In conjunction with this functional description of terrorism, there is a clarification that I think is in order. I mentioned political religious motivation. And today, we often speak of religious terrorism. It's a term that we frequently find in the press, and it has also come into use in technical discussions and even some writings. Well, let us consider that religion can be lived and practiced in two ways. It can be lived and practiced as faith, or it can be lived and practiced as ideology. When religion is practiced as faith, it is nothing other than the relationship between creature and creator. Of course, we're talking about the believer. Instead, when religion is practiced as ideology, well, then it steps into the political arena. Therefore, it is wrong to speak in terms of religious terrorism. It is instead possible and beautiful to speak of the political religious motivation behind terrorism, which, as we know it today within the context of terrorism, is the result of the thoughts and activities of radical elements. Let me pass on to the second aspect of terrorism that I would like to touch upon. And I would like in particular to refer to 4 manifestations of terrorism. There are many manifestations of terrorism, but I believe that there are 4 that can be considered major. The first and the second are quite obvious. Domestic terrorism entails citizens and territory of only one state. International terrorism entails citizens or territory of 2 or more states. It becomes a bit more difficult to conceptualize when we get into the third major manifestation. That is to say, terrorism is a stage within the spectrum, within the progressive spectrum of unconventional conflict. The spectrum of unconventional conflict intended as a potential revolutionary cycle begins with subversive agitation. It can be followed by terrorism. It can subsequently be followed by insurgency. There is a difference between terrorism and insurgency insofar as insurgents control at least part of the national territory at least part of the time. Terrorists do not control territory in the terrorist stage. The next stage might be civil war, and the final stage is revolution. So the terrorism becomes a stage when, from subversive agitation, there is a move to a more advanced stage. However, there is a fourth way. There is a fourth major way in which terrorism can manifest itself, and that is as an instrument within any stage of the spectrum of unconventional conflict. As an instrument, as a tactic, as isolated acts, terrorism can already be present in the stage of subversive agitation. And it can be present, as it is present, in more advanced stages, such as insurgency and civil war. If we look just as an example at Iraq and Afghanistan, certainly we are beyond the stage of terrorism. We're at the stage of either insurgency or civil war, depending on how one wishes to analyze that particular situation. But can we deny that terrorism is present in Iraq and in Afghanistan? It is present, not as a stage, but as an instrument within stages that go beyond terrorism itself. And I frequently have a problem with my students in getting this point through, but I think it has to be considered if we want to have a complete and organic overview of terrorism. One of the problems that I have with most terrorist definitions is the fact that they are not indicative of the structures and dynamics that make terrorism particularly what it is. I'm referring obviously to the clandestine structure of terrorism. I think my colleague Colonel Camp mentioned the fact that to be considered a combatant, one must wear a uniform or a distinctive sign. One must bear arms openly. There must be a leadership chain, and all facets of the international law of war have to be applied. Exactly. So terrorists are totally out of this requirement. They don't respect any of them. Finally, the third aspect, which again should be relatively obvious, is the fact that terrorism is a threat in all cases to law and order, and in certain cases, even to national security and possibly, as it happens, to regional stability. It is not a problem to prosecute terrorist acts. Obviously, to prosecute an individual, the individual has to be arrested. But once an individual is arrested, to be prosecuted for terrorist acts certainly is not a problem, because every terrorist act is a crime. We're talking about murders, maimings, abductions, and whatever else, including damage to public and private property. I certainly agree with that. The problem is another. The problem is countering terrorism as a phenomenon. And there is no way that we're going to be able to counter terrorism as a phenomenon unless we understand what it is, unless we are able to analyze all of its elements, all of its manifestations, which go beyond the four major ones that I mentioned, unless we understand the geopolitical area in which terrorism operates. Ultimately, if we're unable to define a phenomenon, there is no way that we can either support it or counter it. And of course, terrorism needs to be countered because it's a menace to humanity as a whole these days. Today being the anniversary of 9/11, please allow me, since I'm an old soldier myself, to express my appreciation to all American soldiers who have died in the defense of freedom. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Ivan Koedjikov to comment on the discussion here, I will be the last speaker of the panel. And I take upon myself a mission which might be mission impossible. Some friends of mine in the panel would refer to that as beating my head against the wall. I prefer the term salmon fish who's riding against the stream. But nevertheless, however you would define that, I would like to argue that a definition of terrorism is necessary. As it's written here, based on the panel, we should have had a question mark, but I would leave it as is, a fundamental counterterrorism measure. And this is a task and a goal that I personally set to myself, but I think that the international community should set as a goal to achieve, because we will never reach the level of international counterterrorism efficiency and international counterterrorism cooperation, which is needed, not just to confront the terrorist attacks which we are facing today, but the new challenges of terrorism which is banging on our door. And it will not be that long until we will need to face them, and I refer to non-conventional terrorism, chemical, biological, and so on and so forth. We would never be able actually to get to the level of international counterterrorism efficiency which is needed to deal with that without agreeing on the basic issue. What are we fighting against as a common denominator? There are two main arguments against defining terrorism, and both of them were expressed in the panel. One, well, it's maybe nice, it's good to have, but it's impossible. We will never reach an agreement. This is a very subjective term, and you cannot use objective tools to deal with this subjective term. And of course, the slogan which is being used time and again in order to so-called justify this argument is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Shows how subjective it is. If you fight against me, you are a terrorist. If you are doing the same things to others, you are a freedom fighter. I beg to differ, and I will explain the difference at the end of my presentation. The other argument, also we heard it here, not only that it's impossible, we really don't need it. We fight against terrorism today quite successfully. We don't need it. We have international resolutions. The Security Council has international resolutions against terrorism. So why do we need to bother that? By the way, they don't even need to use the term terrorism, because how do they deal with that? You have international resolutions against suicide attacks, without necessarily use the term terrorism, against hijackings, kidnappings, all the criminal acts that terrorists are doing. If we will just criminalize those acts, we don't need to define what terrorism is. Seems reasonable, but it's not. I would argue, how can you really outlaw terrorist organization and accept that as a rule, not just in one state, but in all states, without agreeing on what is terrorism all about? What is the definition of terrorism? How can you outlaw incitement for terrorism without defining what terrorism is? How can you judge anyone for being a member of a terrorist organization if you don't define what is terrorism? How can you extradite terrorists? And here we talk about international cooperation. How can you extradite or demand from a state to extradite a terrorist if you don't share the same definition of terrorism? How can you drive the monetary support of terrorist organizations that is flying from one state to another state, transfers of money and so on and so forth, if you don't agree on one definition of terrorism? How can you argue that this or the other state is a state that sponsored terrorism if you don't agree what is terrorism all about? So in order to reach this and many other higher level of counterterrorism cooperation and activity, higher than it is today, you need a definition of terrorism which will be internationally widely accepted. Yes, I know this operational mind. Look, I came from the battlefield, and I know what is terrorism, because when anybody shoots me, I shoot back. I don't ask questions, are you a terrorist, are you guerrilla warfare, are you insurgent, who cares? I shoot back. Yes, that's true. In the battlefield, you don't ask questions. But when you're out of the battlefield, you need to start to ask those questions, because you need to understand that countering terrorism only in the battlefield, in the military battlefield, it's good, but it's not good enough. It's not going to cease terrorism. What would cease terrorism is a much higher level of strategic counterterrorism strategy. And without a definition of terrorism, we will never reach this level. The definition that I suggest to use is different from the definition that was proposed, but not that different. It's short, precise, and objective as much as possible. Terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians, not combatants, not any person who is not taking part in hostilities. Civilians. Aimed against civilians or civilian targets in order to achieve political ends. And we can down-drill and say which political ends: nationalistic, socio-economical, ideological, and religious political goals. Because when somebody is trying to topple down regimes with a religious flag and create instead a caliphate state that will be run by the Sharia law, that's a religious political goal. So those are the pillars. This definition doesn't create a new international moral law or rule. Actually, it follows the logic, the moral logic of the international humanitarian law altogether, the Geneva Conventions altogether, which differ between deliberate attack against military targets and deliberate attacks against civilian targets, which is forbidden in any situation. The definition that I suggest holds only 3 elements. The use of violence. Many definitions around the world are using terrorism is the use of violence or the threat to use of violence. Excuse me, the threat to use violence is not terrorism. The threat to use violence is the threat to use terrorism, which could be outlawed by itself, but it's not the felony, which is called terrorism. Against civilians, and here I would like to elaborate on that. Not, as some definitions are using, not innocent civilians or civilian targets. Why? Because innocent and innocence is a subjective term. And civilians is an objective term which is defined in international conventions, what is a civilian target and what is not. I don't accept the non-combatants concept. I don't accept not because I don't want to accept. Of course, I love the idea that any attack against my soldiers, IDF soldiers for that matter, would be regarded as terrorism. But I'm trying to achieve here a tool. I'm trying to achieve here a tool that will be widely accepted, not just between Richard Kemp and me, or Britain and Israel. It should be widely accepted by the international community, including third world countries, including people which identify with those terrorists, including people which support the goals that the terrorists are trying to achieve, and maybe even see some of those terrorists as the real representative, genuine representatives. I want to bring them to share with me the same definition, and I'll explain how. So, non-combatants is not good enough for that purpose. Why? By the definition of non-combatants, United States do not actually refers to the attack against the warship, the Cole, in 2002 in Yemen as terrorist act. I don't. It's a hostile act. It may be an act of war, but it's not a terrorist act. An attack against Israeli soldiers in Lebanon or anywhere else, which is not necessarily in the immediate battlefield at that time, this is not terrorism. It's guerrilla warfare, it's insurgency, we can define it in so many other definitions, but it's not terrorism. Now, listen to that. I'm not legitimizing that. Anyone who attacks my soldiers is my enemy, and I have all the right in the world to fight back. My son is a soldier. Anybody that will put his finger on him is my enemy. And I have all the right in the world to fight back, and maybe to, in a preventive measure, to kill him before he's trying to kill my soldier. But from the moral aspect, this is totally different when they deliberately target military target and when they are getting into a schoolyard or kindergarten and butcher those kids. That's terrorism. Terrorism is a modus operandi. Terrorism is tactic. Terrorism is not a goal by itself. And this brings us back. And we will go back to that. Actually, let's talk about it right now. The problem is that the slogan, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, is being used by both ends of the spectrum. The terrorists are using that, and those which are raising the flag of counterterrorism are using that. The terrorists are saying, we are not terrorists because we are freedom fighters. Those which are promoting counterterrorism are saying, and I will quote Senator Henry Jackson in 1987, saying the following: the thought that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is unacceptable. Freedom fighters or revolutionaries do not blow up buses with non-combatants. Terrorist murderers do. Freedom fighters do not kidnap and slaughter students. Terrorist murderers do. Excuse me. Freedom fighters are doing all of the above sometimes. So we need to differ between the goal, which is freedom fighting, or fighting for the freedom. The freedom is the goal. You want to get independence, to get rid of occupation. That's freedom. That's the goal. And if you are trying to achieve that, you're a freedom fighter. And between the means that you are using in order to achieve this goal. And the first thing you should ask, you have the right to use violence? You know what? That's my personal perspective. I accept that some other people would say it's not conceivable. But from my point of view, I support any freedom fighter in the world. And I believe that any freedom fighter in the world has the right to use violence against an occupying state. He doesn't have the right to deliberately attack civilian targets, i.e. terrorists or terrorism. By the way, you immediately will translate it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I will explain my thoughts on that. From my point of view, and here I'm saying as an Israeli, I don't see Hamas nor Hezbollah as freedom fighters. Because we are the freedom fighters. They want to prevent our right to live in an independent Jewish state in this region. And they want to demolish a state and not fighting for the freedom. So on that, no doubt that we will never agree what is a just cause, what is a not just cause, what is real freedom fighting, what is not. You know what? It's not important. Because what is important is what the measures that you are going to achieve in order to promote what you believe is a just cause. Let me give you the definition of the Muslim World League that was given in 2001 in the Durban meeting. The definition that I suggested to you hardly hold 2 lines. The definition of the Muslim World League is 4 pages. I will not bother you with the whole 4 pages. I will read only 1 or 2 articles. Terrorism is an outrageous attack carried out either by individuals, groups, or, Richard, for answering you, or states, against a human being. And now they elaborate. Against his religion, against his life, against his intellect. If you say something stupid to me, this is terrorism, by the way, because you insult my intellect. Against his property, against his honor, I would buy that tomorrow morning. So, such a wide definition. Everything is terrorism. It includes all forms of intimidation, harm, threatening, killing. And listen to that. That's the bottom line. Without a just cause. So if you have a just cause, you can do all of the above. You can kill, you can arson, you can insult, you can do whatever you want because you have a just cause. That's the essential need for the definition. Terrorism has nothing to do with goals. Terrorism is a tactic which should be always forbidden. You know what, my friends? On that, you might call me naive, but on that, we can agree internationally wise. I talked with Palestinians. I talked with Muslims. I talked with people which do not recognize Israel. And on that, they can agree with me that the deliberate attack against civilian targets should be out of the question, even if you have a just cause. Because on the just cause, we probably are not going to agree ever. Of course, this definition raises not one, but many problems. And I'm not saying that it's bulletproof, 100%. I will raise some of them. One of them I already mentioned, which is the claim that by defining terrorism like that, you actually legitimize attacks against military targets. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. What I do say that anybody who attacks my soldiers is my problem, not necessarily the problem of the international community. But when somebody deliberately attacks my civilians, it should be regarded as an international problem and not an internal or local problem of any member or any state. What is the question about, and it was raised, I think, by Richard as well, the question of states. So if I'm right, this definition would also have implications on states. Deliberate attack against civilians in order to achieve, or civilian targets in order to achieve political ends, under this definition, the question is, what about states? Does states conduct terrorism or not? And I'll give you a very sincere and direct Jewish answer. Yes and no. Now, what do I mean by yes and no? Yes, states can do terrorism. Yes, states can do atrocities. Sometimes states can do bigger atrocities than non-state or non-state actors because they have much more power. No, because we don't need to define the terrorism. It's already being defined by the international community as a crime, either a war crime or a crime against humanity. The paradox is that what is forbidden for states to do is not forbidden for non-state actors to do. That's why we need now to take what is the burden on the shoulder of the state and put this burden on the shoulder of the terrorist organizations. Okay, maybe I succeeded to persuade you on that point, but then you would say, okay, it's an interesting academic drill. It doesn't have any real merit. Those terrorists doesn't think like you. They kill whoever they want. Look at that. Give me one organization today which is only deliberately attacking military personnel. They all do all of the above. Sometimes they kill military targets, attack military targets. Sometimes they attack a civilian target. So there is no merit for this definition. And I'm saying, why should those organizations deliberately attack military personnel? Why should this organization make the decision to refrain from attacking civilians when the international community doesn't pose this as a threshold for them? I'm arguing, and I'm ready to debate anyone who thinks differently, that terrorist organizations are rational actors, at least in the level of the leadership of the organization. They calculate costs and benefits. They are choosing the alternative which they believe is more beneficial for their causes. Of course, their calculus is different than mine, but they have their own calculus. We should influence their calculus. We should induce our consideration, our measures in order to change the consideration. Now, I want this terrorist tomorrow morning, or the leader of the terrorist organization, which he decides that he wants to attack Israel, I want him to ask the question, should I attack military targets or should I attack civilian targets? What will be more beneficial for me to do? Right now, I'm telling you, it's much more beneficial to attack civilian targets. And you know why? A, it's easier. B, you get much more media attention. C, much less possibility of being hurt in the attack. I want him to know that if he crossed this threshold, he is not becoming the enemy of Israel, he's becoming the enemy of the world. He cannot then travel safely all over the world. There will not be a question if this organization then conducted is the military arm or it's the Department of Science and Technology of that group is a terrorist organization. The whole organization crosses the Rubicon River and becomes a terrorist organization and therefore being treated as such by the international community based on the international agreed objective definition. By the way, this threshold is not dynamic, it's very sustained, but the organization might cross from an organization that does not use terrorism, might use violence but not terrorism, but might also go back. Once the organization, say tomorrow morning Hamas, come forward, and based on that definition is saying, look, we hate Israel, we don't acknowledge the right of Israel to exist, and we are going to fight for our freedom. And we are going to use violence for that. But from now on, we are not going to deliberately attack civilian targets because it's immoral, because it's not beneficial, because. And from that time on, it's not just an oral statement. Actually, he dismantled the terrorist capabilities. He's preventing himself from launching those attacks. From that time on, I would not refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization. Still an enemy, by the way, but not the same kind of enemy that used to be before. I would understand that the international community see this organization in a different way. You know what? It might sound weird to you. If you would pose this alternative to Hamas today, I'm not so sure that Hamas will not consider that seriously. Is this not counterterrorism? This is not an effective counterterrorism or an achievement that we would like to achieve? I beg to differ. I do think that this is a goal, a worthy goal. So I think, I don't know if I was persuasive enough, but the heat was definitely high. So some of you might think that I'm naive in this effort. I would say that maybe I'm naive. I think that the international community will be forced to achieve an international objective definition, hopefully along the lines of those that I suggested. I think it will be forced because the challenge of terrorism is going to be much bigger, much more dangerous than what we used to know until recently, and there will be no other way but agreeing first and foremost what is terrorism, and then take all these other political consideration out and be forced, even those that doesn't really want, those states that today are sponsoring terrorism will be forced to be obliged to the international norms and the international definition. Thank you very much. Now, the first commentator, and then we'll open the discussion, the floor for discussion, will be Ivan Koedjikov. Ivan is a very important guest at this year's conference. He's the head of the Action Against Crime Department Counterterrorism Coordinator at the Council of Europe. I will not read the whole bio. Believe me, this is a bio of a person who knows what he's talking about. So Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you. As a commentator, I will speak from this place. And the reason I'm a commentator is that when we exchanged with Dr. Ganor before the seminar, I told him, look, I'm very much willing to participate in the workshop on this important topic, but I have little to say institutionally because the Council of Europe is not, at the moment, defining terrorism.
So
is not.
You can say it quietly.
I can say it quietly and quite openly, and I'll be happy to do it. But nevertheless, I thought I would start as it is customary with the opening joke. There are many things that people do not know about the Council of Europe. One of the lesser known anecdotes about the Council of Europe is that our current Secretary General, Mr. Torbjørn Jagland, a Norwegian politician, also is the president of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. He's the one under whose chairmanship the Peace Prize went to Obama, to the European Union, to the Chinese dissidents. So I am quite confident. He still has 1 year to go, so not much time. Time is melting. So if and when there is an internationally accepted definition, I think we all agree that we will delegate Dr. Ganor to travel to Oslo and receive it on behalf of this panel. He's the best placed person. Now, these, of course, are serious things. There are two ways to define terrorism. One way is to directly describe in the definition what it is, and another way is to refer to different international instruments, or, as the case may be, I think this is the case of the U.S. Patriot Act. They say that any act which is criminal under U.S. criminal law or the criminal law of any other state. Now that's quite sweeping. Lawyers may discuss about this, but so either you describe directly or you refer to something else. Now, the direct description, there have been several of them. Arsen referred to one, which is that of the Security Council resolution, which was adopted soon after the tragic events in Beslan. I don't know whether anyone of you knows about the existence of an NGO, actually, which is called the Beslan Mothers. I have met them in my career. I have been to quite a few war zones and conflict areas and refugee camps and what have you. These women I met in the comfort of cabinets in Strasbourg. These women, they no longer cry. When you hear how the words they describe, what they had to tell their kids. Sorry, it's one of the my most riveting experiences. When you listen to these women describe what they had to tell their children to convince them to drink their urine, to survive a couple of hours more. They all died. Sorry. Now, to go back to the UN Security Council definition, what it describes is echoed in most of the definitions we heard here. The UN Security Council definition speaks about criminal acts with the intent to cause death or serious bodily injury. Then there are, or taking hostages, that was particularly because of Beslan, with a purpose to provoke a state of terror in the general public or in a group of persons, intimidate a population, or compel a government or an international organization to do or not to do things. Now, this is what is repeated in most of the definitions. Now, to go back a little bit before, in the 70s, the Council of Europe was interested in defining terrorism, and the first element of a definition came in a declaration by the Committee of Ministers at the time, which linked terrorism to democracy. Terrorism destroys democracy. What follows from this element, it was rather more forcefully said many years later, is that you should not destroy democracy in order to fight terrorism. Another next step, which I would like to dwell a little bit upon, was the Council of Europe Convention on the Suppression of Terrorism, which is from 1977. This is a convention which has now 46 ratifications, so it's rather widely ratified. One country, I think, forgot to ratify, signed but forgot, that's Andorra. And this convention sought to define further what terrorism is, only in the context, mostly in the context of extradition, because you will remember that in those days, countries within Europe very often would refuse extradition on the ground that that was a political offense. And it was thought at the time that since the basis of the Council of Europe is that it is a club of like-minded nations with the same understanding of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, it would be possible to extend a little bit the definition. So, the definition, there is an Article 1 which lists, makes a couple of references to already existing documents. An offense within the scope of the Convention on the Suppression of Unlawful Seizure of Aircraft. Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Civil Aviation, quoted 2 conventions. One convention which was in the process of being prepared is not quoted but is described, and that's the Convention on concerning attacks against the life, physical integrity or liberty of internationally protected persons, including diplomatic agents. Then there are 2 new lines to include in what is terrorism: an offense involving kidnapping, the taking of a hostage, or serious unlawful detention. That was new, novelty at the time. An offensive involving the use of a bomb, grenade, rocket, automatic firearm, or letter or parcel bomb if this use endangers persons. So these were the 2 new elements which were brought in by that definition. And there is an Article 2 which gives and these are the kind of a must elements, which must not be considered a political offense. And then there is another article which broadens a little bit. States may not consider a political offense, a number of other things. Now, in the explanatory report to the convention, and that was much discussed at the time, and this is a point which I would like to draw your attention to, is that these were considered particularly odious crimes at the time. And this is a very important element. Terrorism is a particularly odious crime. Why? Because every new spiral of terrorism breaks another taboo. No human society, and that's my personal reflection if you wish, no human society can exist without a number of taboos. Since time immemorial, you don't eat human flesh, full stop. You don't marry your mother, full stop. You don't blow airplanes off the sky. That taboo was broken. As a result, fighting terrorism, investing billions and billions of euro, dollars and shekels and whatnot into building a whole industry of preventing that. You don't fly airplanes into buildings. That was another taboo that was broken. Which is the next taboo? You don't detain children and deprive them of drinking water for 3 days before killing them. These are all taboos. The question is, which is the next taboo that will be broken? I don't know. There are many security measures before you board a plane. You can board a high-speed train in France or in other countries without any such measure. If such a train is blown, there will be debris 5 kilometers long. So when that happens, probably that taboo will be broken, and there will be need of many measures, very expensive, or like the expensive measures that we learn now about to develop capacity to totally follow and profile everybody. That costs a lot of money. Many questions are asked. Do we want to live in a society such as we saw in the Minority Report? Where to draw the line, and so on and so forth. But this is the element of odious. Terrorism is always, always a very odious crime. Now, what is interesting is that in those days, and again, this is my personal comment, if you look at what the Council of Europe was doing, it was not talking a lot about human rights and terrorism. This all started after 9/11, when we had the extraordinary rendition program, when we had Guantanamo and such other things. Then the Committee of Ministers adopted guidelines on respecting human rights while fighting terrorism, on respecting freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. And then we had in 2005 we had another convention for the prevention of terrorism, which criminalizes many acts that can lead to terrorism. But this convention does not contain a definition. It makes references to international instruments. It has a list attached to it of international universal instruments against terrorism. Now, this is what I think I can contribute from the point of view of what the Council of Europe has done. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it is not on the agenda of the Council of Europe. Our member states do not show any appetite to expand the definition which has been adopted by the European Union. I myself have witnessed the difficulties, as many of you have, in international fora. The last discussion of the UN Global Strategy, which took place in 2012 in June. I spoke for the Council of Europe, and then during the discussion time, all of a sudden, and outside of the context of what was being discussed, there was an attack on Israel, right of reply to the reply, very quick. And I must say the attack came from what would then be considered a moderate North African state. I had visited the previous week. They had no policy of attacking Israel. Why did it come? Nobody knows. The Israeli diplomats replied with dignity, but it hijacked a little bit of the discussion. So this is what happens very quickly. Then the term terrorist state comes up. I mean, you know all the story. So it is very difficult to I will not go far as to say that it is not possible. It's probably not the definition itself. It's the context of the definition. Do you apply it? Where do you apply it? And how do you apply it? So that is very difficult. Maybe one day it will be possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I knew that the first hand that will be in the air will be Robbie Friedman. So Robbie, please present yourself and give us your comment. Don't worry, it's not under consideration.
Just in case. Let's say that your definition is accepted. A, once a suicide bomber succeeds, who is your address to make any charges? And if they do not succeed, who is the organizational address to make any charges? In other words, who do you bring to justice? Who do you bring to court? Who do you...
I'm not following the question, I have to say. What do you mean? What is this different from the situation right now? Who am I bringing now to charges if a suicide attacker is...
That's my question. If you have the definition, what do you do with the definition? And
Okay.
corollary to that is what happens to cases that are somewhat blurry. If you look at the Fort Hood incident, it has all the jihadi terrorist elements. It is still defined by the United States government as workplace violence. So there are some difficulties in the definition, but I'd like to go to the step that, yes, it's all widely accepted. What's the...
Okay, so it's after the Nobel Prize. Okay. So now after the Nobel Prize, I'm a judge, and I'm sitting in the courtroom, and there is a person who was planning the attack in Beth-Lead Junction, a dual suicide attack. To those who doesn't know, we had a suicide attack more than a decade ago in Beth-Lead Junction, which is not that far from here. It was on Sunday morning. the first suicide attacker came to a station which is being used for hitchhiking, but it's especially for soldiers. And he blew himself in the midst of a group of soldiers that was just finishing their weekend vacation and were on the way back to their bases. The second suicide attacker came a few minutes after that, and he actually blew himself immediately when he came there, killing other soldiers and civilians altogether. Now I'm the judge, and Israel have captured so-called the planner of the attack. Actually, Israel did. And he is sitting here with his lawyer, who defends him, and is saying to me, look, you got already the Nobel Prize based on what? Based on differing between attacks which are deliberately conducted against military targets and attacks which are deliberately conducted against civilians. Now, I'm defending here a person who planned a deliberate attack against military target, and I can prove that. You think it's a coincidence that it happened on Sunday morning? We could have done it on every other day, every other timing. It was Sunday morning because we were looking for the soldiers. We could blow up the next bus station, which is a civilian bus station. We didn't. We went to the hitchhiking place of the soldiers. So you have no right to judge me under the laws of terrorism under your definition. My answer to him would be, you are right. That's true. In reference to the first attack that you planned. But the second suicide attacker that you sent, planning to do so, you send him to blow himself up on the first responders and on the civilians that will come and help the terrorists, the soldiers. And therefore, just by doing that, you committed a terrorist attack, and I can criminalize you as a terrorist altogether. I think that this is a tool, and this is an effective tool that can be done. I do agree with you, Robbie, that even, I said it's not a bulletproof definition, and there are gray zones, and there are blurred situations, which I'm not sure that I have solution to all of them. To most of them, probably you can surprise me with the blurred scenario, but there would be some cases which would be difficult. By the way, police officers will not be difficult in this respect, because police officers, by definition, those are civilians. It's a civilian apparatus, and attacking police officers, it's a terrorist act. But there would be a question of the leaders of the state, the question of the Minister of Defense. I won't get into those specifics, but I would say that even if those are blurred situations that, in my view, can be solved in an international agreement, still we solve by this definition or something which is close to this definition 90, 95, maybe 99% of the cases, and we leave only 1% as a blurred or questionable. Yes. You're the second. Please. No, the lady there.
So, my name is Barbie. I work actually with Boaz Ganor. I don't want to challenge you too much, but it's...
I pay your salary, so try me.
We'll see if you approve of the question. I was going to ask something very similar to what you asked on mirrored cases. What happens also in a third case if a terrorist organisation claims responsibility for an attack that, for example, the attack happened on a soldier? I was thinking a bit like the case that Richard Kemp mentioned in London. I know he was an off-duty soldier, but
Thank you for asking. Actually, it shows that we are a very democratic institute. I'll refer to that, but I want to get a few questions and maybe to other panelists as well, and then we'll answer everything. Please.
I want to give an extension for Robbie's question prior to the definition being accepted. In order to pose the question, I'll introduce myself as one of the co-founders of the Counter-Terrorism Victims Organization. And I pose the question because I was offended this morning at this conference to have a discussion, a conversation with a European journalist who said, and I quote, we don't call them terrorists, we can't be seen to be taking sides. Now, the problem that we have prior to a definition to be accepted, when we want to bring a terrorist organization to court in America or wherever, we cannot do so because there is no definition of terrorism. What we're doing right now for terror victims in Israel is trying to bring civil action suits against, for instance, the Arab Bank in America that funded terror. But we're out on a limb without a definition. Now, with the views of European journalists and even the European Union, who cannot define even Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, and European journalists who say we cannot be taking sides by calling them that they're fighters, how do we challenge the Western media and politicians who refuse for political incorrectness to call a terrorist a terrorist?
Thank you for the question. I presume this is not the question that is posed to me. It's posed to the panel, and they will answer as well. Please.
My name is Rob Pinfold, and I actually work with Intrusive Platform on these issues. I'm going to take the classic coward's way out in disassociating myself from my question, but we've been working on this all year, and it's my question to you, Dr. Ganor. And this is what people come back at us with. They say, well, the definition would be great. You know, a definition in international law, it would have an international, then you have a system for prosecuting people. But you look at the moment, we have systems for prosecuting states that don't behave themselves, or individuals that don't behave themselves. And yet still international law is subverted because it's mainly a question of political will a lot of the time. Dr. Norrell mentioned it with the European Union, for example. They have a definition of terrorism, but they still could not yet prescribe the entire Hezbollah organization, only the military wing. So if we did get this magic, you know, not a magic bullet, but you know, this definition of terrorism that was enshrined in international law, how then would we go about ensuring that it's not subverted by political will and it actually has some substance?
Thank you. Another question or remark? Yes, please.
I came from a place where nothing impossible. You said impossible, you find a definition. I think it is possible. And my concern is what's out there. And I'm following what you are saying. Dr. Magnus mentioned that this issue could be a political interpretation. So our problem will be to overcome not only the issue of the definition, as well as to give a prior answer with a political interpretation. Because it's, let's say, if you give the example of Cyprus, where Dr. Magnus gave the example of Cyprus, that they arrested the person, but somehow let him go.
No, they didn't leave him. They didn't let him go. He was convicted, but not on terrorist crimes.
Yeah, okay. And I think that they point to some other things. So I think that our concern should be as well to the political interpretation.
Thank you. We'll start with the round of answers. If you will have further questions, we still have time for another round of questions. I suggest that we will start with Arsen. We'll go one after the other, and I will be the last to answer.
On the question of willpower versus action, there's no doubt you need both. And the EU is a prime example. They had a definition of terrorism since 2002, but it took them 10 years, arguably longer, to prescribe Hezbollah, and even then it was only the military wing. That in itself was a political decision. Political willpower will always be a player, but unless we can, we as a society, unless we can enforce our own will on them, our own raise the issue, raise the stakes on them, why it's important, why they must take the action. If we have a definition, which they must, where they legally obliged to enforce, to cooperate with other judicial systems and other extradition, so on and so forth, that may increase pressure on them to exercise their willpower. But without that, a definition is useless unless you have the willpower to actually implement that.
Yep. Contact. The issue over the journalists not being able to take sides, or sorry, was it a journalist or a EU? Because Britain's not in the EU. Are we?
We have that problem in Britain as well.
I thought I didn't. Oh, we are. Well, I'm personally not in the EU, even though Britain might be. Yeah, I mean that's. I can't answer a question about that because it's just a reality, and it's a reality that we all face all of the time. And it's you even our politicians often will not refer to terrorists. They sometimes do, but it depends who they are and what they're doing. And so I don't think I've ever heard any British politician in recent years referring to, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah or anyone who's attacked Israeli targets as being a terrorist.
They call the London bombing a terrorist act.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. It depends who the target is. They're a bit selective about that. Sorry? Yeah. Well, that was terrorism. But what goes on over here isn't terrorism. I think the whole business of political will and desire to implement or to make use of the definition of terrorism, I think maybe even Boaz mentioned at the beginning, is not something that is going to be. You can't sort of force it. It's whether it's there, whether it isn't there. People will still interpret it in their own way, and they will still argue that a case is not a case of terrorism. And in Britain, we do have quite a well-defined, and I think a reasonable. It's not as good as the Jewish diplomatic corps' definition of terrorism, but a reasonable definition of terrorism, which we use it all the time. And I mean, I forget the exact statistics, but in the last year, I think we've convicted sort of 50 people under terrorism legislation. Who Boaz will be delighted to hear, most of whom I think were involved in planning terrorism against civilians. But you can't. Well, if you don't have the will to implement, then you can't do it. And a classic example is Hezbollah, and people have mentioned it many times here. I was once involved in various working groups in the British government involved in proscription of terrorist organisations, including Hezbollah, and I came under enormous pressure from the Israelis. I mean, I barely slept during periods when proscription was being considered, but from various hammerings I got from the Israelis about how we must do it. But it was impossible, and I agreed with that. I have to say, I agreed with full proscription of Hezbollah. This is going back a few years. It was impossible to persuade the Foreign Office to support it. It was impossible to get the government to support it. And it's just all about. It's not about whether Hezbollah is a terrorist organisation or not. It's all about whether it suits the current government's political agenda or doesn't suit them to deal with it. So I'm sorry, it's not really answered the question, but a few rambling thoughts. We'll get a much better answer now from Dr. Magnus Norrell.
Oh yeah. well, on the issue, I get that a lot here. On European journalists, live with it because it's going to happen again and again and again and again. But two, don't generalize too much. I'm a bit miffed that you say European journalists. Everybody's not like that. So I see that, but we'll keep it that way because there's a lot out there. But it is a political issue for so many people, so you're not going to get away from that. And on the question of definitions, I didn't say it was impossible to get a definition. I thought it was pretty impossible to agree with it. But I hope I'm wrong. You know, I'd pitch in with Boaz's definition anytime. You know, I'd be happy to see that through. But I still think that we can achieve a lot of the goals that Boaz mentioned while we're having that fight. You know, we don't have to wait around for that kind of definition. But it is so much tied up with politics, as Richard was mentioning here. You know, it depends on the government in power. Another reason that the European Union could not agree to designate the whole Hezbollah organization as a terrorist organization was precisely because you wanted to have a door into them. And I remember I was arguing with my own foreign office and said, I have a door into them. I have no problems if you designate the whole group. You know, I can still call them up on my cell phone, but didn't cut no ice.
Since the 1960s, we have seen terrorist acts, what are normally referred to as terrorist acts, in terms of attacks carried out for political, religious, or political social considerations. There is always an ideology behind what we call a terrorist act. The terrorist act itself is a crime because of the nature of the act. I think a distinction has to be made between a terrorist act and the terrorist phenomenon. The terrorist phenomenon is something much more difficult to define, for the simple reason that the term terrorism and the term terrorist are not precise terms. We managed to put under that heading a lot of crimes committed for specific ends and carried out according to certain modalities. That's why I refer to clandestine structures and dynamics. It's clearly difficult to reach a conclusion with respect to the term terrorism, to give it a legal basis. When adjectives, what is the adjective that was used in condemning terrorism that you used a couple of odious? Surely, the individual acts committed by terrorists are odious. I mean, there is a degree of odiousness with respect to crimes. Killing a child is by far more odious than killing an adult, but we're always talking about crimes. The additional difficulty is that each country has experienced in different ways the so-called terrorist phenomenon. The British have at home the Irish problem. The Italians have had the Red Brigades in addition to a variety of riotous groups, separatist groups, and what have you. So the tendency is normally to view the issue in terms of what is the experience of the particular country, and that goes for Israel as well, obviously. And Israel has had a very serious problem, both within Israel and abroad against Jews. All of that makes it very difficult to come up with some kind of a definition. There is the reason why I refuse to provide to my students a definition. I always use the term functional description, and I try to indicate those elements that, on the basis of the experience that we have had since the 1960s, would correspond to the terrorist phenomenon as we have known it. I'm not going to go into legal considerations, because insofar as we don't have a universal definition, it's kind of useless to attempt to say what might be done in court. What I can say is that I am not at all pleased with the way the United Nations and the European Union have approached the problem. They tend to list a variety of actions under terrorist rubrics without actually defining terrorism. They list a variety of acts which could be carried out either by what we might call a terrorist group, but they might also be carried out by organized crime organizations or even by common criminals. That is the basis of the whole problem. We are dealing with something that we are unable to pinpoint beyond our specific geopolitical experience, and that is the basis of the problem. I hope I have been clear. I'm certainly a frustrated person. I've been dealing with terrorism since 1978, when Aldo Moro was abducted by the Red Brigades. The functional description that I use has helped me, I would say, in about 95% of the cases. But there is a 5% that I myself am in difficulty in trying to point it out. And I had the same problem in working for the U.S. Senate, for the Select Committees on Intelligence, and what have you. So we're facing a problem, but I think we have to distinguish between individual acts and an attempt to somehow give as a minimum, a conceptual reference to the phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you. In the year 1900, in Paris, there was a world exposition. That was when the Eiffel Tower was first exposed. And on that occasion, France brought to Paris a person from one of its colonies. I believe in those days they would refer to that person as a sauvage, because they wanted to parade this person in whatever state of folkloric dress to impress the world exposition. When that person was introduced to the place of the exposition, there was, of course, many people, a crowd of people, that person stopped dead and refused to walk into the exposition. So they had to put in considerable time to convince that person, and it turned out that the person was afraid because he realized that anybody could kill him at an instant. And he said, where I come from, when you see somebody you don't know, you stop at about 100 meters, you go through a ritual of gestures to establish friendly intentions, and only then you approach. Now, that story is used by a classical book for diplomacy, which is called Le Diplomate, to underline the importance of diplomatic protocol. Now, slitting a throat of a soldier on duty, off duty, in uniform or not in uniform, civilian or military, is a crime. You do not do that. It is a punishable crime. If we don't have that, if we have no confidence that this will not happen here, anybody here could, in theory, slit the throat of somebody else very rapidly. All it takes is a knife or something, a cutter, and determination. So that is a common law crime. Whether you need a specific text in your criminal law to identify this as a terrorist offense, which then will entail a more severe punishment, that is debatable. We are asking in our Convention for Prevention of Terrorism our Council of Europe member states to criminalize certain offenses, and the response from some of them, not all, it depends from legal system to legal system. Some of them, they say, we don't need to criminalize in particular that offense because we deal with it through our legal construction of, well, in France in particular, association de malfaiteurs. It's a group of ill-intent people, whichever way it translates into English. So most of the, at least Council of Europe states, they believe that internally, nationally, terrorism can and should be dealt with as a common crime because it takes away the glamour from terrorism. They are not combatants, there's no question of cause. A crime is a crime. Now, definition is important, I think, very important for Israel, understandably so, but the important element in the definition is the international element. How you deal with, in a situation of conflict, basically, how do you deal with a situation where my freedom fighter is your terrorist or the other way around? But nationally, a crime is a crime, whether committed by a freedom fighter or by a terrorist. Now, to the question about a journalist, I would use a quote which I have heard, I don't know whether it is his quote, from the previous Secretary General of the Council of Europe, a British politician. I served in his private office. He used to say, to repeat, he said, for a politician to complain about the press is the same as if a sailor would complain about the weather. I think these are wise words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer to some of the questions that was posed. First of all, the question of membership of a terrorist organization. A person was engaged in killing, intentionally killing a soldier. but he's a member of a terrorist organization, which is happening almost on a regular basis. As I said before, until today, the terrorist organizations are doing all of the above together. Well, in my view, the person that was deliberately attacked a military target or a soldier, for that matter, should not be judged for a terrorism felony. In a minute, I'll explain what should be done with a person like that. He can be brought to court for being a member of a terrorist organization, and this is a felony by itself, on top of other things. But that is not, the fact that he's a member of a terrorist organization doesn't mean that what he did is necessarily a terrorist act. Now, I would like to elaborate on that, and based on this concept of the definition of terrorism that I suggest here, the differ between civilian targets and military targets, I think that also in the second stage, a new concept of punishment should be also based on that. And I would differ between the treatment that I would give to an adversary who's conducted terrorist act or a guerrilla or insurgency against the soldiers and has been captured. Terrorists, i.e. those that deliberately attack civilians, I would bring them to court because, as said before, terrorism is a certain type of a crime. It's crime, but to say that it's a crime, it's not enough. It's a certain type of a crime and need to be treated as a certain type of a crime. And those that deliberately attack military personnel, if I capture them, I would not bring them to court, and I would not judge them, and I would not refer to that as a crime as such. I would refer to them as POWs, and I would put them in prisoners of war camps. It's not necessarily lesser punishment than putting them in jail. Actually, it might be even more than that, because those would not be free ever until one of the two things would happen. Either the government will decide under certain conditions that they want to make a reconciliation act or whatever and will free them, or you, the terrorist organization that they belong to and conducted the attack under his name, will announce the cessation of conflict, will dismantle itself, and from that time on, sign peace with the state, then they might be free. Today, if we take Israel, for example, we have this question of freeing terrorists from the prison every now and then. Every step that Israel is doing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, Israel is being demanded to free terrorists. And then they start the question, which terrorists? Would it be Hamas activists or would it be Fatah activists? Would it be with blood on their hands or not blood? Which blood? Would it be Palestinian blood on their hands or Jewish blood on their hands? Did they kill or just injured? So many stupid questions at the end of the day. The only thing that should be regarded, who are they? Terrorists or not? Because if they are terrorists, they should spend their whole punishment that they got in jail, not be free, because they are criminals, because they conducted a criminal act. They should not be free, even if you sign peace with the Palestinians. If they deliberately attack soldiers, that's a different ball game, and the government should have the leverage to free some of them, all of them, whatever is necessary during the peace accords. That's the way I see that. As for the question of politicized use of or misuse of a definition, yes, it's something that we should take under consideration. We live in a politicized world, and even if the definition that I suggest or another definition will be adopted, nobody is guaranteeing that it will be used the way that it's needed. And as we see that states that sometimes conduct, I think it's happening right now, no? War crimes is not being forced to pay the international price and the tag price, which is set for this specific crime because of political considerations and international affairs and so on and so forth. I, of course, mean the fact that Syria was and still using probably chemicals against its own citizens. This is a crime, and we don't see Assad being dragged into the International Criminal Court. That's true. The same thing might happen if we'll have a definition, and people will disregard it. But I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic by saying, as I mentioned before, that I believe that the world will understand that they need it when things will come worst. And therefore, since I think that terrorism is going to be much worse, and again, I don't know if it's optimism or pessimism, I'm quite convinced that at the end of the day, the international community will wake up to this nightmare and understand that they need a definition like that, and hopefully accept the concept of the definition and follow it. I would say one thing and conclude with that. There is one thing which is worse than the situation right now, which is a lack of international acceptable definition. The one thing which is worst is accepting a bad definition. So between choosing a bad definition, the one along the lines of what I read of the Muslim World League definition, or the situation that we don't have definition as the situation it is right now, I would stay the way that it is. Okay, I saw, yes, please.
That's the second question, right?
No, it's
it's
the second. What happens at 7:30? Second question, the UN is already very biased against Israel. Don't you think they're just going to use that to say, oh, well, the IDF has also killed innocent people, therefore the IDF is a bunch of terrorists? And thirdly, I'm very surprised that I don't see that maybe one of the more important differences between terror attacks and criminal acts, because the global process does not or should not, at least in my opinion, exist when it comes to terrorists. So the sanctions is very crucial in that part. So to say that he's committed a crime, many people commit crimes, but that's where the difference lies. That's my third.
Thank you. Any further hands I saw here, please?
It's funny that we took here some sort of a historical perspective. Just spent a weekend in Stockholm, visited the Alfred Nobel Museum as a chemist. It was a reminder that Alfred Nobel, in his will, wanted among one of the prizes, the Nobel Prize, because he regretted for the invention of dynamite. That was back in 1895, before World War I and World War II, all the wars that we had. Now that brings me back, maybe if we look for the definition of what terrorism is, we have to address the lowest common denominator, which everybody agrees about, and this is weapons of mass destruction. Because all the rest is too close to crimes, which is already being fought using other means. See what happened over the last 3 weeks. Almost all of the free world became very agitated because of what happened in Syria. Now with all the technology which is out there, cyber, biological warfare, proliferation of nuclear devices, maybe if we look for an acceptable definition, we should just do away with weapons of mass destruction being the source that we all will fight, and leave the rest, because otherwise I think we'll stay an academic issue and not be something more practical as it should.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Shall be brief?
I'll try to translate you. Okay.
Okay, I'll do it short in English.
Okay.
Is piracy at ISIS? Is piracy at ISIS rapid terror, crime, or combination? Maybe some new form of being aggressive to each other.
Good question. Any further questions? If not, then we'll... Yes, please. Very well. Okay, so we'll now answer in the orderly manner. I will start, we'll move on to Arsen, and then I will conclude the whole session. As for the examples that you gave, I said that there are blurred situations, blurred scenarios, but I have to admit that your two examples are not blurred at all, in my view. Because the definition talks about deliberate attack against civilian targets or military targets. Deliberate attack, like you have murder in first degree and so on and so forth, the intention is crucial. If there is a fact that, by definition, in a civilian bus, there were one soldier, or two soldiers, or three soldiers, or you know what, everybody were soldiers there, by coincidence. This does not grant the perpetrator the claim that this was a guerrilla act and not a terrorist act. He deliberately attacked a civilian bus, not knowingly that there will be a soldier there, or three soldiers, or five soldiers. Therefore, this is a terrorist act. As for reserve duty, again, it's an easy answer. I'm a reserve duty officer as well, but I'm a civilian. So right now, anybody who would deliberately attack me, he will be a terrorist if it's based on political grievances and so on and so forth, okay? But once I'm being called to serve in active duty, at that time, I'm a target, a military target. And that's a situation, by the way, not just in reference to terrorism, even in a regular war. And the Geneva Conventions refers to that as well. Once you're being called to active duty, you're being regarded as a soldier, by all means. As for the suggestion to seclude the definition of terrorism just to mass destruction, I beg to differ. You know, you're a chemist, and that's why it's so clear to you. But I would say that this concept have created the idea that we can deal with terrorism based on specific things that terrorists are doing. Then others that are preoccupied with the air traffic, they would say, of course, wait a minute, yes, you are right, mass destruction, but let's put on top of that hijackings as well. And others would say, what about suicide attacks? Can we seclude that? Terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. We need to define terrorism. Terrorism can be hijackings, terrorist attacks. It could be kidnappings. It could be suicide attacks. And it could be mass destruction attacks or non-conventional or chemical terrorist attacks or biological or so on and so forth. That's also in reference to the question of cyber. By the definition that I suggest, it's again the same concept. If it's deliberate cyber attacks against military target, it's not terrorism. If it's deliberate cyber attacks which is conducted in order to promote political goals and political causes, it's not hackerism or organized crime, stealing credit cards numbers and so on and so forth. It will be cyber terrorism. As for piracy, same thing. Piracy is a crime. Piracy is a crime, always have been and probably always will be. But if somebody, a terrorist organization, using piracy in order to promote its political goals and ends, this criminal act might become a terrorist act as well at the same time.
Piracy generates revenue.
Okay, fine.
Revenue as a direct link to all the
If
famous or new famous terrorists.
in cases the terrorist organizations use piracy in order to gather revenues, it's definitely an act that serves the terrorist organization by itself. Now, if it's harming a civilian target, it's a terrorist act, no doubt about it. As, for example, terrorists are involved in we talked about it, of course, but we talked about counterfeited medicines, okay? So right now, terrorist organizations are using counterfeited medicines in order to earn revenues. This is not a terrorist act. This is a criminal act which is being conducted by terrorists in order to gain revenues. But once they'll make the decision, hopefully never, but once they will make a decision to use these counterfeited medicines in order to kill civilians around the world, this will be a terrorist act by using counterfeited medicines. Same thing is about piracy. That's the way I understand that.
I'll be very quick, although it's not so much different to what Dr. Ganor just said. On the issue of cyber terrorism, I don't believe we should be looking at prescribing individual acts of terrorism. Whether it's cyber terrorism, whether it's economic terrorism these days, currency manipulation, and so on and so forth, what we need to be looking at is the goals and the motivations of the actual act itself. And within that, it could be a whole plethora of different types of acts. On the issue of weapons of mass destruction, it's tough enough trying to define terrorism, let alone what a weapon of mass destruction is. Is it a chemical weapon? Is it a missile? What about somebody driving a truck into a crowd at a pedestrian? Again, the key there, I think, is to look at how those weapons are used and to what purpose and intentions.
Well, the most lethal weapon of mass destruction is the AK-47.
Is the whole of the Jewish diplomatic corps here? Because every question seems to come from someone. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to be fairly brief as well, but I think the question of whether a reservist soldier is a legitimate target, whether some soldiers are killed in a terrorist attack and some civilians are killed in a terrorist attack. I think because I don't agree with the Nobel laureate to my right, I wouldn't distinguish between them. I can understand to an extent. I understand where Dr. Bain is coming from, but I can see possibly.
You just don't understand where he's going to.
I've got no idea where you're going to. I know where you've been. I'm going to watch where you go. But I can possibly accept that an on-duty soldier with a rifle, with a helmet, and all the rest of it, possibly you could distinguish between him and a civilian. But how you distinguish between somebody like, as you mentioned earlier, our drummer who was killed on the streets of London, he was off duty. He wasn't in his barracks. He was not far from the barracks, but he was no different to a civilian walking beside him in the road. His death, to me, is no different to a civilian's death in either in motivation. He wasn't. In fact, he was killed because he was a soldier. But equally, you know, the similar terrorists, in my terms, have killed British civilians in Britain not because they're soldiers. So I think to distinguish between an on and off duty soldier, possible, but to completely distinguish between a soldier and a civilian in the way that that's been suggested, I think is I can't get my head around at this point. Maybe I'll think about it more. But and it sort of leads in also to the question of the police. Yes, the police are civilians in the UK, apparently here as well. But if you take Northern Ireland as an example, which was a transnational terrorist situation because some of the terrorists involved in it came from Southern Ireland, which is a different country. You may not know that, but it is. When they rebelled against us, they didn't get the north, they only got the south. And and also they used the IRA made considerable use of expertise and weapons and explosives from overseas, including, of course, famously large shipments of Semtex from Libya. But some of the people who were most actively involved in defence of the state against that terrorism were the police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, who lost a huge number of people in that process. How can you distinguish between what they were doing and what the soldiers were doing there? Because they were doing exactly the same thing in many respects. And equally, there are far more civilians now on the battlefield actively taking part in military operations than ever before. And that includes technicians who are sometimes in forward positions, servicing military equipment and making sure it can still fight. The question comes again of the intelligence services, which I would say is a similar issue to the police. So I don't see personally the distinction. The only other thing I want to say, I think, is that there's two other things. First of all, the accusation of IDF people killing innocent civilians. I think, in my understanding, I've no doubt the IDF have sometimes deliberately killed innocent civilians in the same way as British soldiers have sometimes deliberately killed innocent civilians, not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of indiscipline among soldiers. But I think where in the majority of cases where innocent civilians have been killed on the battlefield by the IDF, the British, the Americans, it is incidental to what they were trying to achieve, and sometimes it's impossible, as you know, to achieve a military objective without the death of civilians. So I would sort of dismiss that as almost a red herring. I think as to whether due process should exist for terrorists, which I think you're suggesting it shouldn't. Certainly in Britain it does, and I find it hard to see how you could, within a country's legal system, how you could not apply due process. Sorry? Oh yeah, well okay, fine. That's slightly different. I was thinking about once you'd arrested them, but if you weren't going to arrest them, that's fine. And also the point about, just to bring in briefly the point that Boaz mentioned about the sanction for what he would define as a not a terrorist but had killed soldiers on the streets, say, of Tel Aviv or London. I think that would his part of his motivation in his definition of terrorism is to deter terrorists and to give them a disincentive for carrying out terrorist activity. I think in some respects that might undermine that argument by giving them the status of prisoners of war, because many people in terrorist organisations, it apply particularly to the Irish, as it applies also to some Islamist terrorists in the UK, they want to be considered soldiers, they want to be treated as prisoners of war. They may not want to go to prison, but they'd certainly rather go to prison as a prisoner of war than as a common criminal among the rapists and the child molesters.
Well, I had my say, so I'll rest my case now.
Just three very quick comments regarding some of the remarks that have been made. First, under no circumstances would I be able to consider a so-called terrorist or so-called terrorist group legitimate combatants. Consequently, I cannot accept the idea that an attack against soldiers by such individuals, whether soldiers are on duty or not, can be considered a so-called terrorist act. It simply is an attack against them, and if we're going to use the term terrorism, I would say it falls within terrorism. Second, weapons of mass destruction. I challenge the use of non-conventional terrorism that some authors used in conjunction with the eventual use of weapons of mass destruction by terrorist groups. They have used thus far biological and chemical weapons. I'm not aware of their having used nuclear or dirty bombs. Terrorism is always unconventional for the simple reason that it is a form of conventional conflict. So regardless of what instrument they use, terrorism remains an unconventional phenomenon. Third, with respect to so-called cyber terrorism, I think we should always bear in mind that there is a distinction must be made between cybercrime, cyber war, and cyber terrorism. To the best of my knowledge, there have been no terrorist actions that entailed the destruction, the paralyzation of industrial systems or whatever else through the use of information technology. The use of information technology by terrorists, as far as I know, to this point, has been limited to a support instrument. In other words, such activities as collecting information, communicating, training individuals, and if you will, taking responsibility for terrorist acts or issuing terrorist threats. In that case, it would be a sort of terrorist acts in terms of the fact that intimidation substantially constitutes aggression. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, I think that, of course, I agree that we should not seek to define individual acts. There are elements which are common to all different types of terrorist attacks. On the issue of weapons of mass destruction or no destruction, there is an element of indiscriminate use, which covers both trucks with conventional weapons or dirty bombs, or so it has been present in various definitions for quite some. The notion of indiscriminate effect. I also think that it's important to limit the area of application of a definition, because the issues of collateral damage or in armed conflict, they cannot be solved through a definition of terrorism. And I'm a little bit surprised to hear what comes through sometimes as a willingness to exonerate killing of soldiers from being a crime. It is a crime, not on the battlefield, but if it happens in the country, it is a crime. So on also the notion of damage to property is there for quite some time in various definitions, and it covers damage to infrastructure. It would cover, in particular in the 77 convention already, there is a notion of damage to property if it endangers considerable collective danger to people, collective danger, which would be the case of cyber terrorism or damage to infrastructure or to hospital or to power grid or to whatever. So there are things which are there which cover quite a variety of what exists, and we should not go into describing the individual types of terrorist attack which exist today, because if only for the reason that we don't know what they will come up with tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Two remarks to things that Richard said, and we'll conclude with that. As for the off-duty soldier, the reason that I refer to that as, I wouldn't say legitimate target, but different than a terrorist target, it's because I think that we need to stick to some kind of reciprocity. And as much, and the targeted killing was mentioned here, as much as in targeted killing, I think that the state has the right, under certain conditions, to attack the terrorist, even if he's sleeping at home and he's not in the battlefield mode or not in the way to the target. This is the reciprocity that I refer to in the other side. As for the IRA, you've said that the IRA, that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to achieve the status of POW or a soldier or whatever. Actually, this is proving my point. I want them to want that, and I want them to decide to, if they decide tomorrow morning that they want to attack me, I want them to aim their fire against my soldiers and not against my civilians. This is achievement in counterterrorism. If I will be able to see to it that Hamas, from now on, would never attack civilians and would look for the soldiers know how to fight back, even if they are on vacation. They know that they might be a target, and if they don't know, they should know. And this would be an achievement to see that the fire will be turned off from the civilians to the terrorists. So I want them to crave for this position of prisoner of war and look for the soldiers and not for the civilians. So as you probably have noticed, or you didn't, we didn't solve the problem of the definition of terrorism. We even didn't agree on one definition. And the only thing that I do hope that you take from this panel is food for thought. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the panel. Thank you very much for the discussion.